Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell, and with me tonight is Dr. Don Preston. Don, how are you doing?
Doing great, William. Doing very, very well. About to get cold over here in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Winter has fallen all of a sudden. It got down to about 26
right.
degrees.
I just came out of the winter.
Yeah. I mean, just last week it was in the 70s, and it's just beautiful. And all of a sudden, it got down to 26 degrees last night, and it's cold out there. Both of my dogs have discovered the joy of coming inside and sleeping inside during the night. Boy, my wife is too soft-hearted, and so she started letting them in when it would get really cold last year, actually. And we've got 2 big, soft, warm beds for them in our sunroom. And I mean to tell you what, if the temperature hits around 40, I open that back door, and they will hurt themselves getting inside, and they each go to their respective bed, and it's like, good night, go away. Okay, we're in, go away. It's really quite amusing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is. It's cold. I don't like it.
Yeah, it's cold here. I just came in a few moments ago, and then I noticed that I'm having a bit of a toothache that, my dentist has been watching this tooth. I got one that's, kind of problematic. So they've been looking at it for some time now. I don't know, it's been a couple of years or more. But I think they need to stop looking at it now because it's beginning to bother me a little bit tonight, and maybe because I was out in the cold air, so it doesn't feel good. And, I think I'm going to have to call her up and say, look, do something with this thing, and let's get moving so I can have some relief. I do not want to be, having half side of my head aching. And
no. So that's absolutely miserable.
Yeah.
It is absolutely miserable to have a toothache. But anyway, things are just continuing to rock right along. Heard from 2 different people from Canada this week. And been hearing from people from different parts of the world. Continue to I'm just so thrilled right now. I think I announced I began a study on my YouTube of the 70 weeks of Daniel, chapter 9, 24 and following. And my viewership has jumped almost by 200 views. I guess you'd call it per day, not quite per day, but let's say after 2 days, a 2-day tally it's up by 200. And so I'm very, very pleased with that. And the videos that I am doing and review and response to Brock Hollett's book, Debunking Preterism, are approaching 1,000 views after a week. So while by some standards that certainly is not tremendous, you look and you see some some YouTube videos, they've had 1 million views, and you're going, oh, wow, good grief. So that's incredible. But when you're averaging, 400, 500, 600, and then all of a sudden you jump to 700 or 800, then that's a pretty nice jump, and we appreciate that very much.
Yeah, that's really, really good to have, the kind of traffic. And it's well overdue, I think, for the effort and work that's been put out there and giving people an opportunity to learn. But then again, I know some of it has to do with, the people who put a little bit of confidence in those who think that they are able to refute covenant eschatology. And so when you have that dynamic going on, in addition to providing, just excellent lessons day after day and, week after week, year in after year, it's definitely going to cause an increase in those who view. And so, that's just a testimony to your consistency and the quality of the messages that you present. And it's very
well,
good.
What's interesting, I appreciate that. What's interesting, I'm sorry. What's interesting to me is that a week or so ago, an acolyte, I will use that term, of one of our outspoken critics, he appeared on my YouTube calling me a coward, a liar, et cetera, and saying I didn't have the courage to answer any questions that could be posed, and he had a list of questions from this outspoken critic, a man that I personally have blocked, and I think you do too. But nonetheless, he just appeared literally out of nowhere, calling me a liar, calling me a false teacher, all this kind of stuff, saying I didn't have courage to answer the questions. And I responded, I said, number one, you don't come on my YouTube comment section and start calling me names and start demanding that I answer your questions. I said, if you want to engage in dialogue, then that's one thing. If you're simply here to call names, then you're not welcome. And by the way, you will be blocked. And I said, now, since you've made some accusations about what I believe or don't believe, here are a series of questions that you will answer. I said, now, when you provide the answers to my questions and to my arguments, I said, I will be more than happy to respond to the questions that you have copied and pasted, because I can tell you this. Those questions are some of the most illogical, presuppositional, fictionally based questions that I have ever seen in my life. One of the questions, William, for instance, was, is it your belief that a spiritual being must have spiritual blood to be alive? And I'm going, seriously? That's actually supposed to be a bit. Yeah, what is spiritual blood? My goodness gracious. Well, I posted my questions. He ignored them and came back and said that I had to answer the questions. I reminded him again of what my rules were. He's not going to just come on there and make demands of me. He has no right to take over my YouTube channel and my comment section. But if he would answer my questions, answer my arguments, I would address his questions. They're not his questions. They belong to the other man. All of a sudden, he's disappeared. Hasn't said a word, hasn't posted another comment, and the same is true over on Facebook, in which I've been posting the same arguments in response to this one individual who does the same thing. He copies and pastes the comments from this one individual preacher. He doesn't think for himself. I don't think he's ever had an independent thought in his entire life. And so I told him, come on my Facebook page and make demands of me. If you want to engage in dialogue, let's go for it. But you don't come on here calling me names and making demands of me. That doesn't work. It's not your page, it's mine. Well, he has all but disappeared himself, except for now he's just sniping. He pops up again to make some snide, sarcastic bitter remarks, but no arguments. And that's kind of the way of it, William. And as you and I have discussed on this program before, you know that you're making headway. You know that your arguments are powerful when men who consider themselves to be the absolute champions of the anti-preterist movement, they come on, they take pot shots at you, but when you demand that they answer your arguments, when you answer their arguments, and then you demand that they answer yours, and all they do is, number one, they ridicule, they call names, or they disappear, then you know that they realize they cannot answer the arguments. And that's exactly what has happened on YouTube. It's exactly what happens on Facebook. And so, I have people ask me all the time, they said, Don, how do you put up with all the name calling? How do you put up with all of the sniping? I had somebody send me a very kind email this week, just absolutely amazed at the hateful, the caustic, the ungodly attitudes of people who just attack me incessantly. And I just told them, they said, what is the motivating factor? And I just responded. I said, well, number one, with certain individuals, you can sum up their attitudes in one word, and it's called jealousy. And I said, what's so strange and telling about one particular individual who literally stalks me on Facebook. I said that individual had been kicked off of one Facebook page after another for his ungodly attitude, his ungodly postings. So what does he do? He established his own Facebook page, and now when I try to post in response to him, my posts are completely moderated, and he will not allow me to post my responses. That's telling to me, William. It's extremely telling. He realizes he can't answer the arguments, and so he, quote, moderates my comments, and what that means is he doesn't allow my comments to be seen. Very telling indeed.
Oh, yeah, it happens. And I'm familiar with the kind of behavior you're talking about because it happens, to me as well, and happens, on a consistent basis. Sometimes when you get these, people who are on and, all they have is a bunch of ridicule and snide remarks, to comment about you and about, what you think or what you say. And, it's just, you really don't want to waste your time with them for the most part. After you've answered them a couple of times, it's time to move on and just continue to do what you do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In some circumstances, sometimes you're torn. Don't cast your pearls before swine. And on the other side of that, you feel like that there are people who are reading, who are auditing, who are learning from the engagement. And they're seeing the fallacy, they're seeing the weakness of those who claim to be champions, and I hear from them, even though I tire very quickly sometimes of some of the absolute nonsense that is posted by people who are former preterists and who claim to have the answer to preterism, and yet, as I made comment early last week in response to this one individual, I just made the comment. You're literally making this stuff up as you go along, aren't you? This is not theology. This is a joke. I didn't use that term, but that's what it is. It's literally a joke. The argumentation is so illogical, so unscriptural, so biased, so prejudiced, it makes no sense whatsoever, and yet he's putting it out there as if this is the truth of the gospel that refutes preterism. Well, when you respond to it and you show what the Scripture actually says, then all of a sudden he'll run to another Facebook page, start a totally different conversation on a totally different subject. And as I said, that to me is extremely, extremely telling. It's revealing. It shows that people like that know they've been cornered, they know they've been answered, they know they've been refuted, and so they'll just start another conversation on a different subject and say, well, these preterists, they can't answer this. Well, so we blew you out of the water on the other chain, on the other discussion. So now you'll do something else and act like that conversation never even happened. So, yeah, it's frustrating on one hand, but again, on the other hand, you receive private remarks, private emails, private conversation, private messages that say your responses are so helpful for me to better understand how to answer the objections. And so when you receive comments like that, you say, well, okay, I didn't really want to engage that individual anymore. They're so bad. But if people are watching, if people are listening, if people are reading, then okay, I'll continue to offer some comments. So that's kind of the way it goes. You have to keep plodding along. One friend of mine on Facebook, he was once a preterist. He abandoned it, but recently came back. And he wrote a post on Facebook after I had answered, 2 or 3 different individuals. And he said, well, I would just personally like to thank Don K. Preston. He said, in spite of the fact of all the reading that he does, all the research that he does, all of the writing of articles that he does, all of the videos that he does, he comes on Facebook and engages half of the skeptics on Facebook and puts them to rout. So he said, I really appreciate what he's doing. I thought that was kind of a funny post.
Yep. And I know
well,
that's
anyway,
really, really incensed, some of the detractors, because they hate to see anybody speak well of you, especially in regard to dealing with their, opposition and false arguments that they make on a routine basis.
Oh my goodness, that's exactly right. When this individual posted like he did, appreciation for the time that I spent, a couple of people said, well, I see that you've been brainwashed by Don Preston. You're nothing but a blind follower. On and on it goes. So yeah, you just you just have to kind of go on, and sometimes you literally just sit back in the chair and laugh at how ridiculous people are, and then on the other hand, you just kind of shake your head at how sad some people can be. So anyway, with all of that said, we want to get back to our study of the Messianic Temple. We've been involved in Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, and last week we spent time reading from Isaiah chapter 2, and I will read again Isaiah chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, and then skip down to verse 19 and following. Verse 10 following. Enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon every one that is proud and lofty, and upon every one that is lifted up. He shall be brought low. Then we skip down to verse 19. Now, it actually turns upon a repetition, starting with verse 17, actually, but again, I'm going to start with verse 19 for time. They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for the fear of the Lord, for the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake terribly the earth. In that day a man shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they have made, each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the mats, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for fear of the Lord, for the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake terribly the earth. Well, what we were doing last week is we were showing how this passage would occur in the last days. That is the contextual setting for this great terrible day of the Lord is the climax of the last days. And we begin to share from Luke chapter 23, and that's about when we ran out of time. But we called attention to Luke chapter 23, where Jesus was being led to his crucifixion. And the women who loved him followed along. And, Luke tells us in Luke chapter 23 that there was a large multitude of people following along. So the scene is both poignant and powerful. Here is a man being forced to carry his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem. He's being led out to Golgotha, there to die. We can well imagine that in that crowd there are both those who despise this man. They know what his claims are. They haven't been able to refute him. They're tickled to death at what's happening. There are others who have witnessed his miracles, and they know this is a man of God. Kind of makes you wonder from time to time if maybe Nicodemus was there. I mean, after all, he had gone into the Sanhedrin and talked to them. So one can imagine the mixed multitude, and again, Luke says it was a great crowd that followed along. And in that crowd, there were women who loved him. And they were so torn emotionally of what was happening, and they're weeping and they're crying. It turns to them. And you can imagine the pain that it caused him to turn carrying that cross, that burden. But he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bear, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" Now, what's interesting and significant here, William, very, very, very few times do we find commentators a virtual unanimous consensus of agreement. But as I have surveyed the literature, I have examined one passage or one commentator after another, and with just a couple of exceptions, it has struck me as remarkable that virtually all commentators agree that when Jesus says what he did here, they're going to run to the mountains, they're going to run to the hills, and they're going to say, Fall on us, to the hills, cover us. If they do these things in a green tree, what will they do in the dry? The commentators are virtually unanimous in agreement. Jesus is predicting the fall of Jerusalem that would come in that generation. Now, like I said, it's remarkable to me. You very, very, very seldom find all commentators agreeing. But here's a text that they agree on. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, Jesus is citing directly from Isaiah chapter 2, 19 and following. And by the way, the commentators are agreed on that as well. Now, by the way, Isaiah chapter 2, 19 and following is Hosea chapter 10, verse 7 and 8. The language is a little clearer and a little more in sync with Luke chapter 23, but they're parallel passages, so it's not that big of a deal. The point of it is, Jesus is quoting Isaiah's prediction of the last days. What would happen in the last days? The climax of the last days would be the day of the Lord of hosts, when the Lord would come in his glory, in his power, and men would run to the hills. shared with our listeners last week how this language of running to the hills, hiding in the caves, is taken directly from times of warfare. It is used in Judges when the Midianites invaded Israel. It is used in Chronicles when the Philistines invaded the land of Israel. And on both instances, the people of Israel were frightened. They were scared, as well they should have been. Because here is an invading army. Kill you. So what did the people do? They ran to the hills. They hid in the caves. This is not end of the world, end of planet Earth. This is not end of time language. If we allow the Bible to define its own terms, we soon discover that this concept that the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event simply does not work. I pointed out last week that John A.T. Robinson said in 1957 in one of his books, the exhortation or the reality of running to the hills, hiding in the caves at the day of the Lord hardly fit an event that would be over in an instant, in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, when the earth is burned up and all of the elements therein melt with fervent heat. As you pointed out last week about the difficulty of running to the hills when the hills are melting. How do you call on the rocks to fall on you if the rocks are melting? And it's all over in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. So the very language that is used prohibits it from referring to a time-ending, earth-burning, element-melting event. It just doesn't work. Now remember, temple would be built during that period of time. During the last days, obviously prior to this great day of the Lord, but that great day of the Lord would seemingly be the climactic consummation of the building of that temple. Now, I would be the first to admit, Isaiah chapter 2 doesn't say it would be a process of construction, and so we have to glean that from other passages, such as 1 Peter chapter 2, Ephesians chapter 2, in which they were being built up, present active indicative, a habitation of God through the Spirit. They were living stones being present active indicative into the temple of God, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. So when we conflate all of these passages, we see that this Messianic temple would be a process of construction, if I may use that terminology. The day of the Lord is the consummation of that. Now, what does that mean for the dispensational view? Well, the dispensational view is the day of the Lord, when the day of the Lord comes, that is when the temple is constructed at the coming of the Lord. Well, okay, that's supposed to be the second coming of Christ. Well, the second coming of Christ, according to 2 Peter chapter 3, is when the earth and the elements thereof are burned up. Well, wait a minute. According to the dispensational theory, the earth is not burned up until at the end of the millennium. They have their chronology of the day of the Lord completely and totally anachronistically applied. Isaiah chapter 2 is the day of the Lord of hosts. 2 Peter 3 is the day of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 2 is the time of the construction of the Messianic Temple at the day of the Lord. But wait, the day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3 is the end of the millennium when earth is burnt up, supposedly, with a new heaven and a new earth. and again, that's just part of the, how do I describe this in kind words? Part of the imaginary schema of dispensationalism. When you start examining what dispensationalism says about what's supposed to happen at the day of the Lord, they have the different constituent elements of the day of the Lord scattered everywhere, and anachronistically at that. But when we examine the nature of the day of the Lord as described by Isaiah, once again, it cannot be an earth-burning, time-ending, element-burning event. It cannot be that. But here is where it starts getting really, really, really 23. I just shared with you a couple of moments ago. The commentators are agreed that Jesus is citing Isaiah chapter 2, 19 and following. Okay. That means Jesus is applying the last days prophecy of the day of the Lord and the Messianic Temple to his generation, climaxing in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70.
That's a very
William,
key point, Don. Should be emphasized.
Go ahead and drive that home for us, William.
Well,
I saw this years ago and put it in my book, Who is This Babylon? I've put it in my book, Like Father, Like Son. To me, this is such an incredible point. So go ahead and develop that out just a little bit more for us. I've been doing all the talking here.
Well, no, I wanted you to continue with what you were doing. I just wanted to add some emphasis, to have you add some emphasis to it, that these prophecies that so many people are trying to take, out of the book of Daniel, out of Isaiah, out of Zechariah, and force them into some, earlier time of history, just do not work when he says that this was the time of the day of the Lord. And, that is one of the just key points. And not only do you have the prophecy speaking of the day of the Lord, but he talks about some of the attendant events that were related to it, such as, what you've been developing about the house of the Lord being built, that is the Messianic Temple is part of that. And, the sanctuary, it is the time of the judgment. And in other passages, it points out the feast days, which were the end of the harvest feast days that were involved in, the time. And so all of those pointed to the time of the end. All of them pointed to the time of the day of the Lord. And Jesus quotes these passages and applies them, as you were saying, to the time of the end, to the destruction of Jerusalem. And yet these guys come back and want to argue with the Lord and basically say he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, when you read Luke chapter 23 and verse 28 and following, where it says, Jesus turning to them said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren wombs that never bore and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. That's directly quoted from Isaiah chapter 2 and following. And it's quoted in Revelation chapter 6, chapters that deal with the time of the end of heaven and earth, the time of God's wrath being meted out, a time that certainly was future.
Let's save that because
Okay.
we want to develop that. Yeah,
so I will back off at this point and leave it at that.
We want to travel down this road because there is a well-defined highway from Isaiah chapter 2 to Luke 23 to 2 Thessalonians 1 to Revelation chapter 6. This is a well-marked highway if we are watching the signs. And, William, what you were saying there just a moment ago, it is absolutely remarkable I mean, absolutely remarkable. When you start talking to people and you show them, Jesus was quoting from Isaiah chapter 2. Jesus was applying that to AD 70. And they stand up and they go, that simply cannot be true. It cannot apply to AD 70. And you're going, well, what does it apply to then? Are you saying that it applies to the end of time? If you do, then that means at the end of time, men will have time to run to the hills and hide in the caves. Is that what you're saying? Well, that's not what I believe. Well, okay then. It's got to apply to a time when men could run to the hills and hide in the caves. And they really, literally are arguing with Jesus. They're arguing with Paul. They're arguing with John. In other words, they're arguing with the Holy Spirit who caused, obviously, Jesus and Paul and John to apply Isaiah chapter 2 in the same identical way. And so this, and like I said, I saw this connection years ago. And it was one of those epiphany moments where I was just like, whoa, hang on here. It's real easy to see what Isaiah is talking about. And you touched on something there a moment ago, William, that we will develop as we continue to study Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. And that is that the fact that there are other constituent elements of this day that prohibit it from being applied to an end-of-time event. It simply cannot be applied to an end-of-time event. And so when Jesus echoes, not only echoes, but when he quotes Isaiah chapter 2 and applies it to AD 70, when we can go back to Isaiah chapter 2, we can see there that Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 is undeniably a reference to a time of judgment on Israel, which is what Jesus was predicting. Then we have absolutely perfect harmony. And yet, I'll never forget this, William. Some years ago in New York, Ed Stevens and I had a debate with two Reformed millennial guys. And in one of my presentations, or I should say in one of the Q&A sessions, somebody asked about the day of the Lord to define the day of the Lord. And in my response, I marched through Isaiah chapter 2 through 4. Now, obviously, it was an abbreviated presentation. And yet, the point was so clear and so powerful that when the moderator turned to the main spokesman of there were two men debating, Ed Stevens and me. When the moderator turned to them and asked them if they wished to comment on my remarks, they literally just looked at one another. And the main speaker said, well, I've never heard that before. I've got to go home and study that. Well, I appreciate that honesty. I appreciate that candor. And it was some years later that word got to me from an individual who had seen this preacher and asked him his views on eschatology. And he said, well, I have to tell you something. I am like 99.9% a full preterist, and it was a direct result of the debate that I was in New York. He said, I have never in my life experienced anything that day. He said, it turned me upside down. Well, once again, you have to appreciate the candor, appreciate the honesty of that individual in sharing those thoughts. And that's the power of Isaiah chapters 2 through 4.
Yeah,
it is impossible
that there has been, a debate where there hasn't been some conversion of some person from their futurist view to the subject of eschatology. I wanted to go back just a moment to the concept of they're crying out to the rocks, fall on us, and to the hills cover us. That's similar to the statements that Christ made in Matthew 24 about the fleeing event, and also in Luke. And, as they're saying that this doesn't apply to Israel, and they're trying to make it apply to something else other than the time of 70 A.D. Well, I had a fellow trying to respond to some comments that were made by the former Hebrew Israelite guy, Elvin Israel, and me on our most recent radio broadcast this past Sunday. And he was claiming that Matthew 24:30 was a reference to all the world, in other words, the globe. So I asked him the question. I said, okay, then, where are they going to flee to in terms of, if this is coming on all the globe, to where are they going to flee? And, of course, I got no answer to that. But that just becomes another one of those problems, and I just thought I'd mention it in connection with what was being said here. But, as we say, there's always someone, and this gentleman here came as a conversion, if you please, out of one of the debates that was held, and here he is now, teaching other people.
Well, that is absolutely correct. I don't think I've ever had a debate in which there were not people who contacted me later saying, you know what, I attended that debate, or I've watched it online, or I've got the DVDs or MP3s or whatever, and I thought you were the craziest person on the face of the earth, but now I believe what you're saying. It's absolutely the truth. And so, even the debate that I had in Indianapolis in 2008, William, it was a 2-night debate. I had double pneumonia during the entire debate. I would leave the debate, go back to the room, and, excuse the language, just upchuck. I would throw up everything I'd eaten all day long. I was absolutely teetotally miserable. And yet, on the second day of that debate, a couple of preachers approached me and they said, would you mind going out to eat with us? We'd like to buy you lunch. And they said, we've got some questions. And so we went out to lunch. They had all sorts of questions. They were not antagonistic. They were not adversarial. They literally were students. And when I answered their questions, every once in a while, they would just look at each other like, oh, boy, we're in trouble. You know what those looks are like. I was like, oh, boy, oh, boy, oh, boy. And at the end of the conversation, like I said, I could barely sit up, literally. I was so sick. And they said, why did you even agree to go to lunch? Man, you're sick. I said, yes, I am sick, and I don't know what's wrong. But anyway, at the end of the conversation, we were at lunch, hour and a half, 2 hours. They just told me, they said, Brother Preston, you have just really, really given us a lot to think about. We've never thought about this stuff before. It seems to make so much sense. And of course, I responded and I said, brethren, that's because it's the truth, and truth makes sense. I said, now it may be shocking to our traditional sensibilities, and it is, no question about that. It may be shocking to our prejudices and what have you, but I said, truth is inherently sensible once we grasp the concepts. And I said, once we grasp the framework, once we grasp the sensibility of it, the logic of it, I said, the dominoes start falling. And I said, we're in trouble once we start seeing the logic of it. And once again, they'd look at each other like, well, we're probably in trouble then. So anyway, back to Isaiah chapter 2. Here we have Jesus making the application. We don't have to wonder about the application of the day of the Lord in Isaiah chapter 2, 10 and 12, 19 to 22. We don't have to speculate, ponder. Jesus makes the application. Now, here's another point. We've kind of discussed the dispensational view of things, William. I think we need to turn our attention to an examination of both the amillennial and the postmillennial view that says Well, the last days are the Christian age. You and I were both raised in an environment, in a theological culture that said the last days are the Christian age. The Christian age began on Pentecost. The last days began on Pentecost. And we've been in the last days for 2,000 years. And the last days, ostensibly, have nothing whatsoever to do with Israel. God was supposedly through with Israel at the cross. Well, let's take that into consideration in light of Jesus' application of the great and terrible day of the Lord in Isaiah 2 and his application in Luke chapter 23. If it's the case that in Luke 23, 28 to 31, Jesus applied the day of the Lord language to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, then that means that the day of the Lord was in AD 70. But wait, the day of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 2, the day of the Lord, therefore, of Luke chapter 23, was to be the climax of the last days. Well, wait a minute. If the last days are the Christian age, then that means that AD 70, by Jesus' application of Isaiah chapter 2 to AD 70, that means the Christian age ended in AD 70. Well, I think that's kind of problematic.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't work at all. And that raises a question. William, if God was through with Israel at the cross, why was Jesus applying Isaiah chapter 2 to something that was going to happen to Israel in AD 70? Why is Jesus bothered anything about Israel since God was supposedly through with Israel at the cross? Why worry about what's going to happen in AD 70? Just let it happen and go on. But instead, Jesus is applying a last days prophecy of the day of the Lord to what would happen to Israel in AD 70. William, I find that extremely problematic to those who define the last days as the Christian age. What think ye?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. It's very interesting that you have the Bible saying that Jesus died in the end of the age. That is clearly before the Christian age began. It is clearly before the day of Pentecost even occurred. And then on the day of Pentecost, you have the beginning of the last day. So in other words, what you have is two ends juxtaposed, right to each other and or up against each other. And so you got the end of the Jewish age and the last days of the Christian age, but it's the beginning of the last days of the Christian age. Rather interesting, I would think. It makes you wonder, when this alleged end of the Christian age starts, is it going to be the last days of the heavenly age? Because that's the logic that they're using.
Well, it really is, if you want to call it logic. It kind of fails the test of logic when you get right down to it.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
the whole thing gets back to what we've discussed on a previous program when we discussed the identity of the last days. Back in Genesis chapter 49, here we have Jacob telling what would befall his sons in the last days. Well, this is Israel. This is the 12 tribes. Well, if the last days of the Christian age, why is Jacob concerned about what's going to happen to Israel in the last days when Israel stopped being a focus of God and his dealings with Israel at the cross? But as is so typical, William, and you know this as well as I do, in the traditional amillennial view, there are disparate views about the end of the Jewish age. You have the view that says the Jewish age, the Mosaic age, ended at the cross. And AD 70 was a sign that it had ended. You then have others who actually goes so far as to say, in fact, Stafford North, who was a Bible professor at what back then was Oklahoma Christian College. I think it's called Oklahoma Christian Science, Christian College of the Science and the Arts now. Some of them call it OCUSA. And nonetheless, he was a professor of Bible there, a very, very sharp man, very, very erudite, well-read, but he wrote 2 books. And one of them was Armageddon When, another one was Armageddon Again. And in both books, he pointed out that AD 70 was the end of the Old Covenant age. It was the end of the Jewish age. Well, that puts him at direct odds with an awful lot of preachers and other professors in the amillennial world. Did the Old Covenant world end at the cross, or did it end in AD 70? And I can well remember, William, when I was a young man, attending some lectureships. And I will never forget one lectureship that I attended at the Get Well Church of Christ in 1977, maybe. Our daughter was a baby. My mother, my wife, and my baby and I attended the lectureship there at the Get Well Church of Christ. And, of course, this is before I was a heretic. But you know how it goes at lectureships when you're not known to be a heretic. You can just walk up and join in conversations and listen in and what have you. That's part of the environment. Well, there were a group of ministers, and I knew 2 or 3 of them, as a matter of fact. That was casual friends with a couple of them. And I just walked up, and they said hi, and I said hi. They continued their conversation. And the question was there a transitional period between the cross and AD 70? Or was there a transitional period between the cross and Pentecost? And then this group of 4 or 5, perhaps 6 preachers, all 3 of those views were being stated. Now, mind you, this is in the fellowship that claims to have all the answers. We got the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And yet in this group of 3 preachers, as I listened in, one man spoke up and he says, listen, there had to be a transitional period of time between the cross and Pentecost, because if the Old Covenant passed away at the cross, the gospel wasn't probated, didn't begin to be probated until Pentecost. That would have been 50 days without any kind of a law whatsoever. That simply cannot be right. Someone else spoke up and said, well, I think that's true to a certain extent, but what about those Jews in the far-flung regions of the Roman Empire that didn't even hear the gospel for years and years and years? Are we supposed to believe that they're automatically condemned now that the gospel age has begun? And are we supposed to believe that the law of Moses was nailed to the cross, and now here they are living by faith to the very best of their ability? They're justified by faith, even though the law of Moses is in effect, but now the law of Moses is not in effect, and their faith doesn't avail anything whatsoever? How does that reflect on the mercy and the grace of God? Oh, well, we just, no. Colossians chapter 2 is just too clear. The law was nailed to the cross. And 1 or 2 preachers spoke up and said, I'm not so sure that's what that passage says. Well, that's just anathema to even suggest that you've got doubts about that. But it was so fascinating to me. And again, I had just begun my own personal struggles. I wasn't about to jump into that pond full of alligators. And so I just stood and listened, amazed at the variation in the views represented by these 5 or 6 preachers, all of whom were, quote, representative of the amillennial world. Now, had I been able to ask then some of the questions that I would pose now, I suppose most of them would have run screaming from the scene, except the individual who said there had to be a transitional period of time from the cross until AD 70. He would have said, see, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying right there. But this whole concept of the importance of realizing that Isaiah chapter 2 through 4 is dealing with Israel in the last days, and that what is said of the last days simply does not fit the definition of the last days as the Christian age. It doesn't work. It will not work. It cannot work when we define the last days as the Christian age. Now, how does that reflect upon our subject of the Messianic Temple? It reflects directly on it. The Messianic Temple was not, therefore, since the last days are not the Christian age, the Messianic Temple was not to be constructed in the Christian age per se. It was to be constructed in the last days of the Old Covenant age and was to serve as, and to be symbolic of, if you may I use that terminology, of the everlasting kingdom of Christ. It is not a literal physical temple, and we'll get into that as we proceed in our studies here, obviously, but it was to be constructed in the last days. During that last days, let me express it like this. In the last days of the Old Covenant Temple, the New Covenant Temple would be constructed, would undergo construction, be in the process of construction. When the Old Covenant Temple was swept away by the judgment coming of Jesus Christ on the clouds of glory, then the New Covenant Temple was fully anointed. The Shekinah glory cloud, to use that terminology, and I know some people don't even like the terminology of Shekinah glory cloud. I'm not convinced it's bad terminology. But the glory of God came to dwell in, reside in His people who are the temple of God. And so He dwells in us, He lives in us, and we in Him. This is the concept of the Messianic Temple. But again, the problems arise, severe, fatal problems arise when you try to say the Messianic Temple would be constructed in the Christian age. No, the day of the Lord would be the consummation of those last days, and that day of the Lord, according to Jesus' own application of Isaiah chapter 2. Jesus' application of Isaiah chapter 2 is that day of the Lord, to climax the last days, whatever those last days are, Jesus applied that day of the Lord prophecy to AD 70. We do not, therefore, have the right today to say, oh, well, you know what, Isaiah 2, 19 and 22, that was AD 70. But the last days refer to the Christian age. What kind of a mishmash does that make of the prophecy? Are we supposed to believe that it jumps from a reference to the entirety of the Christian age back to AD 70, and then it continues on with the discussion of the Jewish War of 66 to 70 in chapters 3 and 4, and then goes back again to the Messianic Temple in the Christian age? I mean, does that make sense? I suggest to you, it doesn't even make good nonsense. It just doesn't work. When you understand that Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 is one harmonious, organic, united prophecy, it does not jump back and forth. It's not spasmodic. It is united. And that means that the Messianic Temple was to be constructed in the last days of Old Covenant Israel's covenant age, climaxing, according to Jesus himself, in Luke chapter 23 in AD 70. And in our next program, we will see how Paul the Apostle fully agrees with that assessment. In the meantime, folks, we are out of time. Thanks so much for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William, great to be with you again. I will say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.